and then begin my talk. So as Shani was saying, my work is, at least in part, focused on the role of what's called forest therapy or forest medicine. And as I let this clip play through for a few moments, I want you to consider, just as you watch it, if you're drawn into what you're seeing anyway. So if it invokes a sense of interest or makes you feel a particular way, perhaps it results in a certain memory coming up. And in recent years, I've been really interested in the psychology behind why many people enjoy nature so much, how spending time in nature can help us not only to be more mentally rejuvenated, but also to heal faster from illness and promote mental and physical wellness in both youth and in old age. So I'm going to explore today more deeply some assumptions that you might have about nature, which hopefully will help you see, if you don't already know, that connecting with nature can actually be really easy. And I'll present some of the current scientific data on how interacting with nature can promote mental and physical well-being with a focus on aging and older adulthood. And then I'll close with some ideas and practices that you can take with you and hopefully incorporate as you are able into your own life, and to tap into some of these benefits to promote well-being. So we'll be getting in a little bit of mindfulness in nature. It's a little different, but very similar. I've been teaching kind of both these things for a long time, so I do definitely see the overlap. So if you live in a city, or you don't have a yard, or you experience issues with mobility, you might think that nature is something that you really are only able to experience from afar, if at all. And however, we often forget that we're actually really immersed in nature. It is everywhere. And while some idyllic kind of silent space far away from noise might not always be available to us, healing experiences with nature are often a lot closer than we might think. Here are a few images I actually took recently on some walks around downtown Lexington where I live. And, we see nature kind of like growing out of cracks in the pavement, along the street, as well as in our own homes. We find these ways to interact and experience nature. The image at the top center is actually Mills End Park in Portland, Oregon. This is the world's smallest city park. It's about a square foot. And you can, go up to it and interact with it, right? And it's this small kind of natural space, but it does have this beauty if you can kind of get in close and take a look at it. And so nature's benefits are really available to us, or can be made available to us, even in really small ways, regardless of our location. And really since the mid-1980s, and much more so in the past 10 to 15 years, scientists have become increasingly interested in trying to understand a little bit better what a lot of people already intuitively know, that nature is really good for us. And so probably the earliest research that we have looking at the role of nature in health comes from Roger Ulrich. The study compared patients recovering from the same form of a gallbladder surgery on a surgical ward, the layout of which, this ward, as you can see in the diagram on the right, allowed a natural vista for some, and then others saw a brick wall. And so all other things being equal, the surgery, the nurses, the food, the ambient noise level, et cetera, the only real difference was that while convalescing, half could look out their window at grass, trees, and sky, and the other half looked at the brick face of another wing of the hospital. And then patients with the natural vista experienced shorter hospital stays, required lower doses of pain medication during recovery. They had significantly fewer post-operative complications, and they were experienced as being more positively by the nursing staff. So how is it that a view from a window can reduce pain, promote healing, and make us feel better? And there are really several kind of working hypotheses right now in the literature that we're trying to figure out. One focuses on kind of an evolutionary explanation, while the other considers more of kind of the immediate sort of biological and cognitive effects of spending time in nature. So let me begin by showing you kind of an illustrative example of this that I like to use with my students. So I want you to take a look at these two pictures of savannas, and I want you to tell me which one you prefer. And obviously I'm not in the room with you, so I can't tell you, but I will say, most people say that after looking at these images, they prefer B. So if you said B, you're like most people. And if you're not entirely certain why, most people aren't entirely certain why, my students kind of have to pick it apart when they think about it, but most gravitate towards the structure of the trees as being somehow more inviting. Some say like maybe it's more shady, or the explanation I like is like, oh, they're easier to climb, right? You could actually get into one of these trees as opposed to the trees on the left. And so in some ways, this loosely illustrates the idea that human beings, given that we've spent 99.9% of our evolutionary history kind of itinerant in mostly non-built natural environments, it stands to reason that our brains and bodies are kind of best suited and attracted to environments that can maximize our, what we would say, evolutionary fitness. So trees with low-slung branches, wide open canopies would have provided early humans with shade and potentially a place to escape predation. So on a larger scale, we can assume that humans were attracted to specific sorts of locations near but not in forests, close to water, and maybe with a bit of a hill just so they could see anyone coming. And if you look at where we used to put our homes and later, and now our vacation homes, or where many of us like to get away, they tend to encompass these sorts of kind of environments because of access to resources and so on. We not only seem to have a preference for living in such places, but we've consistently recreated these places throughout our history in the form of gardens. And this idea that we evolved to kind of love certain spaces over time and cultivate these spaces for our well-being was first presented in the mid-1980s by famed sociobiologist E.O. Wilson in a book that he wrote by the same title called Biophilia, which literally means a kind of love of nature. That these certain environments that we can engage in have adaptive value. And so loving nature and the idea of feeling safe or good in a specific environment makes maybe good intuitive sense. But what's actually happening in terms of kind of internal processes that could give rise to such feelings? And what are some of the visible effects of spending time in nature? So a researcher by the name of Stephen Kaplan back in the mid-90s presented a little bit more elaborate idea that he called attention restoration theory. And so what attention restoration theory states is that our brain may be better suited for and benefit from nature than the built environment that we generally inhabit. And the reason for that is that attention, or the ability to direct our minds toward a task, is a finite resource, right? We only have so much attention capacity. And our environment places a variety of demands on that resource. And so if you've ever felt overwhelmed with choices, at the store, or you've had too many things to think about, with your job or the stuff going on in your life, these are both examples of demand on attention outstripping that resource. And we generally experience this as a kind of mental fatigue, making it hard to concentrate, making us prone to anxiety or distress. And if the active built world outstrips our attention, Kaplan would say that the natural world has the capacity to restore that attention. And his and others' work have kind of shown that through this process of interacting with nature, we experience this kind of conservation and restoration of our attentional capacity and an overall reduction in fatigue. The finding's been replicated a number of times in both healthy participants as well as those suffering from chronic health problems, which we know when we experience chronic health problems, that actually has a pretty profound effect on our cognitive capacity and our memory. It's not just worry, but it actually does deplete our ability to think clearly and coherently at times. A good example of this effect was a study in breast cancer patients who were instructed to spend 30 minutes 3 times a week doing something outside. That was the only instruction they were given. And they could sort of choose whatever they wanted, whether it was walking. A few of them would kind of go sit in the park or paint. And those in the intervention group experienced improved quality of life, improved attention and memory functioning compared to those in a control kind of condition. So nature appears to stand to restore us both mentally and physically from the built environment of day-to-day existence, which can be a little bit fast-paced and overly taxing. So spending time in nature can also promote physical activity and social interaction with others. And so there are different possible mechanisms for why this is working. As I mentioned at the beginning, a great deal of the research in the area of nature and health has come from science coming out of Japan primarily, and that was really how I got connected with it. I was doing work on mindfulness meditation, and I was teaching about environmentalism in Japan, and I came across this literature, and that's really what got me into it. But in Japan, it's been really interesting. The ministries of health and forestry have actually invested really heavily in infrastructure to get people of all ages in closer contact with the natural world. And so I've been working closely with several of these researchers in recent years, and my own research is focused, at least in part, on trying to replicate some of the findings that are coming out of this literature in Japan in Western populations, right? So it is this a culturally specific effect. It doesn't appear to be. There have been a few studies in the United States. The work that I'm doing in my lab, there have been some studies coming out of Scandinavia as well. In Japan, they take a more kind of biomedical approach to looking at how spending time in nature affects our overall health. And they refer to it as, it used to be called forest bathing, and this kind of sort of taking in or soaking in the atmosphere of the forest. But they actually changed the name to forest therapy because forest bathing was even confusing Japanese people who were engaging in the practice. And so I'm interested in how we can make this kind of more available. And I'll talk about some of those practices here in a bit. By conducting studies that compare, say, time in nature versus time in urban settings, some of these researchers have been able to identify a variety of positive and physical benefits in plants. The individual on the left here, this is Professor Yoshi Miyazaki, who's kind of the godfather of forest therapy research in Japan. And then this is Dr. Miura. He's actually a guide at a park that's really devoted to basically bring people out for a few days at a time. A lot of elderly individuals from the city, they come, it's a old logging forest that's been converted basically to a nature sanctuary, and they do a medical exam. They take you out in the woods, and then you come back and you get another medical exam. And so they collect data this way. So what are some of the established effects that they're finding? Well, Dr. Miyazaki's conducted, like I said, a number of these studies, and both of us are really interested in how we try and identify, say, what constitutes a healthy dose of nature. Do you have to go to the woods? Can you garden or keep houseplants? How long should you walk or sit for while you're outside? Can we apply this work to environments that present obstacles in accessing natural environments? And as we'll see in a second, some of these preliminary answers to these questions we already have, but we really need further scientific work in this area. So this kind of brings me to this next question of, that I'm sure important to the attendees here. What's the evidence that forest medicine is healthy for adults? What actually happens? Well, we know that there are some positive physiologic effects. We see increases in what we call cardiac efficiency, so improved cardiac function, increased heart rate variability, which is kind of a measure of relaxation or reduced arousal. Really consistently, we've seen decreases in blood pressure from pre-post exposure experiences. And this can be like, as you see on the right, the difference between walking or sitting in the woods versus walking or sitting in the city, or even just sitting and interacting with plants, doing kind of some sort of light kind of gardening effects. Psychological effects seem to be improvements in mood and improvements in sleep. And there are some immunological effects like increased natural killer cells. So there's a positive immune response and increased antibody titer to vaccine. And so this meaning that the immune system appears to be boosted by exposure to nature. Dr. Ching Li, who's a colleague of Dr. Miyazaki's, who also has written a lot in this area, thinks it's actually maybe these chemicals being released by plants that our immune systems are coming in contact with that are leading to this increased response. So just exposing yourself to kind of like the nice aroma of a pine forest or a geranium may actually promote immune functioning. You might be interested in the question of like, well, what about populations like older adults? some of the differences between the general research on forest medicine and those in older adults is the need to often adjust how participants interact with nature. A number of these studies are conducted in individuals' homes or long-term care facilities or hospital settings and community gardens. And I think this is an important adjustment to make in the research, particularly because few people have access maybe to nature in and close to home. The term used to describe the healthcare application of interacting with nature is what's called horticulture therapy. And this is engaging people in plant-based activities using plants and gardens to achieve therapeutic effects on physical and mental health. So this could be tabletop gardening, or some form of accessible gardening, or simply spending time in gardens or other green spaces. So in terms of effects, we see similar patterns as with other forms of nature therapy. Indoor gardening and horticultural therapy interventions appear to reduce hypertensive symptoms, promote psychological well-being, increase participants' sense of self-worth and capabilities, and promote social connection between participants. This is also shown to decrease symptoms of depression and loneliness. And so there's a handful of studies I'm describing the results of here, but tends to seem to be promoting some rather positive outcomes. What remains to be seen if these effects are due to kind of horticultural components of the intervention or simply byproducts of doing something enjoyable with a group of people. And we don't have enough controlled research in the specific area to make really good causal assertions yet, but I think we're getting there, and I think we will arrive there. Despite that, there have been some really well-controlled studies that have shown these effects to be replicable. So one of the most interesting ones that I've come across in looking at older adults is the effects of these sorts of practices on patients with dementia, which really affects, I think now just under 6 million Americans. Horticulture therapy, when instituted with individuals experienced dementia, showed reduced problematic behaviors. It increased their mood and their treatment adherence. And this was in 2 separate studies. And then in a third study, patients who were provided with access to what's called a wander garden. This is sort of an enclosed garden. So this was in a care home where they could just kind of wander around and walk free from obstruction, and they can interact with the plants. These individuals showed an increase in physical activity and a 30% reduction in falls, which are a major, issue, as we age, or ability to stay mobile, or we try to stay mobile. It's important to our health. Yet there is a risk of fall and obviously head injury that can come along with that at times. And so the reduction in falls I found to be a really fascinating effect. So these studies indicate in some ways that nature can have a positive physical effect, but also a kind of soothing and stabilizing effect on dementia. So these are really exciting findings because they show that nature has positive effects on health, and this may not be localized to, say, a specific area like a forest, but it can also be accessed if age, mobility, or overall health might make going to woods or a city park more difficult, regardless of whether some of the positive physical and mental benefits of nature are due to other mechanisms such as physical activity or social interaction. People seem to derive measurable improvements in important preventive health markers like reduced cardiovascular risk and derive positive personal and social meaning from interacting with nature. These are low impact and really low cost quality of life interventions that almost anyone can find a way to creatively engage with. So let me just kind of pause my screen here and then see if I pop back up. I want to kind of turn your attention for the remainder of the talk, excuse me, to how you or your loved ones might consider incorporating nature practices in your own life. Some of you may already maintain a close connection to nature. Maybe you raise plants or take walks outside or outdoors. And this is terrific, and as we've seen, also very healthy. So I hope these practices that I've described can help you expand that relationship and give you some new ways of interacting with the natural world. For those of you who feel they don't have much contact with nature, perhaps you'll see some simple ways you can begin to form a more positive relationship with nature in your daily life. And so I'm going to split these practices into two categories I've discussed so far. One is the forest and kind of nature therapy category, and the other being the horticultural therapy category. So the first and most important advice I can give you is to be careful and to know your limits and take things slow. And I tell this to everybody that I do forest therapy type work with. Nature, while beautiful, is, and this is maybe really part of what makes it beautiful, a little bit dangerous. Even when working with my students, I have to be clear. As an example, if you're, say, walking along a path and you're watching the light, overhead in the leaves, you're probably going to trip over a rock or a tree root at some point. And I know this from experience. One of my guiding rules is, therefore, if you aren't watching your feet, you should be standing still. So let's start with a few different kinds of forest therapy practices, keeping in mind that simply because this is referred to as forest therapy, you don't in fact need a forest to practice it. Practice is much more rooted in the kind of mindset that a person takes and the pace that he or she takes in the experience. And when I lead groups of people on forest therapy walks, I always begin with setting the intention for the practice. So several bits of advice I will give you can be applied really to any activity you want to get something out of. One is to set your intention to take time to connect. You should want to do whatever it is that you're doing, and you should have some desire to gain something out of it. So first thing is intention. The second is to not rush. Take time to move and to act slowly and with intentionality. And then the third is whatever activity you're engaging in, trying to bring your full attention or your focus to it, whether it's listening, watching, touching, or whatever. Keeping these things in mind, forest therapy quickly becomes something more than a walk in a park. It's a little bit more akin to an active kind of meditation. During a forest therapy practice, you should try to engage your 5 senses in the process: vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. As we age, our senses really change, and some may not be as sharp as they once were. Some folks have difficulty with mobility. My advice here is to work with what you have available to you. So there's 2 different practices that can really be done anywhere. This first one's called sit spot. Sit spot involves finding a location and visiting it regularly for some intentional period of time. This could be a space in the woods or a park that you come back to regularly, or just a spot in your yard. It could even be an indoor space, maybe a window sill or a corner of a room where you have some plants. Go to that spot and sit. The goal, if there really is one, is to slow down and intimately get to know the place. It's a bit like, think like meeting a friend for coffee regularly. Until that ambulance goes by. Over time, you'll notice things changing, growing, moving. You get a view of the hidden lives of these other creatures that live around us. So the process of sit spot is really about creating a focus on the present moment. And since the quarantine started, I've been doing sit spot in my tiny backyard downtown, and I've recently noticed something new that I hadn't previously noticed, is that the chipmunks that I see each morning is actually one of 3 different chipmunks that live in 2 different holes in the yard, right? So, prior I'm just thinking there's this one very active chipmunk, but it turns out if you look at chipmunks long enough, you can start to tell them apart. And I think they're actually getting used to me being there, which means that they behave a little bit more comfortably around me. And if you like this idea, I can recommend a book by my friend David Haskell, who teaches at Sewanee College of the South in Tennessee. David spent every day for 1 year closely observing the same 1 meter square in the woods behind his house, and he managed to write an entire book about his experience. And so here we can see how a simple activity, if we bring our full attention to it and focus to it, that we can create a more personal connection with nature. This next activity I want to tell you about is I call yard therapy, because it's similar to forest therapy practice, but you only really need a yard. The practice here is to slowly move around the space, not with any specific direction in mind, and engaging each of your 5 senses with different, what we call invitations to experience, right? So starting with vision, you're invited to focus on what's moving. There's often a great deal of large and small movement around us at any time that we might not be focusing on. And so focusing on movement helps train our brains to see more of what's there. Second invitation is to focus on what we see in darkness. We tend to direct our attention towards light spaces, But a great deal is actually going on in these darker spots, like under leaves, inside the gaps in tree barks, and so on. The third invitation is to do what we call close gazing, or getting really close in to look at small details. And admittedly, I myself even have actually started carrying a magnifying glass to help facilitate this process, to just kind of see, what's going on up close, looking at bugs or things like that, and just kind of playing with my attention and what's there. We can engage our hearing in similar ways. An invitation for hearing might be to listen to sound in 4 directions, which means direct your hearing in one direction for a few moments, then turn 90 degrees and orient and pay attention to sounds in that direction. What's different? How does the sound change? What do you notice? Repeat this as you move around. Again, we're kind of moving through different ways of focusing, different ways of attending. So it has a kind of a meditative or cognitive kind of exercise component to it. In terms of touch, this is a really open invitation to just kind of touch plants, feel the bark of a tree, the delicate petals of a flower, the coolness of flowing water. You could even hug a tree, which is actually really nice if it's a tree that you know well, that you can kind of like befriend and interact with and sort of study regularly. And if you feel as though your fingers maybe aren't as sensitive as they once were, you could touch something to your cheek, which tends to remain sensitive. Just be sure it's not poison ivy. Next, you could bring your attention and invite you to kind of follow your nose, smell the aromas around you, see what's there, see if you can identify the source of a smell. I walk a lot on UK's main campus because it's quiet right now, and April was really kind of like verbatim smell, and now it's hyssop, right, is blooming now, so I can kind of smell that licoricey mint on warmer days. And then the final sense is taste. And the one thing I'll tell you about taste is, there are lots of wild plants in our yards, actually in Kentucky, that we can enjoy. If you don't know them for absolutely sure, I certainly don't recommend putting anything in your mouth that you can't absolutely identify. If you grow it for yourself, then of course go ahead. But if you don't have access to the sorts of plants you might want to taste, make a cup of herbal tea and bring that same kind of invitation to your attention to enjoy the color of it, the aroma of it, and then taste it. So you could easily spend a good amount of time on any of these activities, kind of moving through the space that you might want to explore a little bit more deeply. A number of the studies I cited earlier also talked about the use of what I call horticultural therapy, and this is kind of a light form of gardening. I guess it could be kind of a heavy gardening, but really it follows kind of the life cycle of the plant, right? You have seed, germination to seedling, transplanting, growing, and harvesting. And so in horticultural therapy, based on sort of the capabilities that a person has, you can enter in really to any place. It might be sprouting seeds, it might be transplanting, it might be harvesting and flower arrangement. Just whatever somebody's able to do, whatever you're able to do. Maybe you purchase a seedling and transplant it. You want to try and just sort of engage in that activity more fully. We can certainly imagine ourselves spending time doing things like maybe tending houseplants or yard plants, doing things like pruning, watering, fertilizing. And really the key difference here is bringing your full attention and intention to those activities. So if you've ever considered like the care or attention that goes into a bonsai tree, imagine bringing that level of focus to the ficus in your living room, or the African violet on your windowsill, or a tree or a shrub in your yard. And so it may sound in some ways as though I'm recommending that you do things like walk, sit, and observe nature. And on the surface, that may not seem particularly radical in terms of a health intervention, but I think what is radical is how, when done in a particularly mindful way, these practices change how we relate to living things around us, how we observe cycles of growth, decay, and permanence, and how we see ourselves in relation to the natural world. We can easily become isolated and alienated from the space. And the good news is, by setting our attention to connect more fully with nature, it can become a healing force in our lives. And science is really revealing these myriad benefits that we can share with nature. So I want to thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this process. If you are interested in this work more fully, there are some, you can contact me. So my website, which talks a little bit more about my clinical practice, my research work, and my teaching, aarongodlaski.com. My email address at center, aaron.godlaski at center. This is me doing some forest bathing in Japan. And then here's a series of books that I found really helpful and enjoyable in the process. So I'll leave them up there. And then at some point when you get a chance to watch the talk again, you can look at those, or if you have questions. So sorry, I think I ran a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I'll stop there.